You wake up in the middle of the night. Not because of a nightmare, not because of any sound, but because of a weight, a pressure on your chest, a feeling that something is wrong, though you can't name what. The room is silent, but your mind is loud. Your body is still, but your heart races like it's running from a predator that doesn't exist. You feel like you're falling, even though nothing is moving. You're surrounded by safety, and yet you feel completely unsafe. And the worst part? There's no reason. Not one you can explain. No tiger in the room. No sirens in the street. Just this persistent, quiet panic, echoing through your nervous system like a phantom. You sit up in bed, gasping for air that's already there. You check your phone, distract yourself, scroll mindlessly, but nothing helps. The anxiety remains shapeless but solid. You try to remind yourself it will pass, but what if it doesn't? What if this is you now? Now imagine this happening not once, but regularly, randomly, during meetings, in crowded places, even in moments where everything should feel fine, vacations, family dinners, conversations with friends. Suddenly it hits. A wave of unease, a tightening of the jaw, a restlessness in your limbs, 1,000 questions firing in your brain. What if something goes wrong? What if I embarrass myself? What if I fail? But here's the real question. What if this isn't about stress at all? What if anxiety isn't just a chemical imbalance, or too much coffee, or a bad day? What if the very life you've built is generating this unease, quietly, constantly? What if anxiety is not a malfunction, but a message? A message that something is off, not just within you, but around you. That the persona you're wearing doesn't match the soul beneath it. That the pace you're living at is incompatible with the rhythm of your mind. That the values you've adopted are borrowed, not chosen. You were told to hustle, achieve, stay productive. You were told happiness comes after success, peace comes after control, and worth comes after perfection. But what if none of that is true? What if your anxiety is your subconscious trying to wake you up? Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." What if anxiety is the soul's protest, the mind's desperate attempt to be heard over the noise of performance, distraction, and denial? Because maybe anxiety isn't the disease. Maybe it's the symptom of a deeper disconnection. The disconnection between who you are and who you're pretending to be. The disconnection between your inner voice and the outer world. The disconnection between existence and authenticity. What if you've been living a life that was never truly yours, wearing masks that are slowly suffocating you? Chasing goals that don't feed your spirit, only your image? You scroll, you work, you post, you nod in conversations that don't interest you. You play a role. And all the while, something deep inside you whispers, "This isn't it. This isn't me." That whisper becomes a murmur. That murmur becomes a restlessness. And eventually, that restlessness becomes anxiety. Not an enemy, but a compass. A signal that you are out of alignment. A pulse beneath the surface begging you to stop performing and start becoming. So the question isn't, how do I stop being anxious? It's, what part of me is trying to speak through this anxiety? And why have I been ignoring it? What if anxiety is the truth you've buried, demanding to be felt? And if that's true, if anxiety is not the thing you need to kill, but the thing you need to listen to, what does that mean for how you live your life? What happens when anxiety isn't seen as a malfunction, but a doorway? A doorway into your real self, into this possibility we now explore. Let's begin with an uncomfortable truth. You were not born anxious. You were taught to become anxious. But not by a single person, not by one event, not by a malfunctioning brain. Your anxiety is the natural response of a sensitive system trapped inside an unnatural world. It's the consequence of a subtle war between the soul and the structure we call modern life. Let's unravel it. From an early age, you were told who you should be. Be polite. Be strong. Be smart, not too emotional. Be productive. Be someone your parents can be proud of. Be someone society can recognize. And slowly, like layers of paint over a raw canvas, your authentic self was covered, first with expectations, then with comparisons, then with fear. You didn't become anxious because something was wrong with you. You became anxious because something was missing. Permission to be real. Freedom to be whole. Safety to be seen. Carl Jung believed that what we repress does not disappear. It goes underground. Into the unconscious. Into the shadow. The more you suppress your emotions, your needs, your voice, the more your shadow grows. And the shadow doesn't stay silent forever. It begins as restlessness, then becomes dread, then anxiety. Jung wrote, "What you resist persists." In trying to be the perfect version of yourself, you created a fracture inside, a separation between the self and the mask, the soul and the story. And the wider this gap grows, the louder the anxiety becomes. But it's not just internal. You're also bombarded. Constantly. You live in a society that weaponizes your attention, that monetizes your fear, that rewards superficiality and punishes introspection. Aldous Huxley once warned of a dystopia not of censorship, but of distraction, where truth is drowned in a sea of irrelevance. That world has arrived. Scroll, compare, buy, repeat. You're anxious because your nervous system is not meant to process 100 dopamine hits per hour. Because your sense of self-worth has been outsourced to external validation. Because you're comparing your reality to curated illusions. You're anxious not because you're broken, but because you've been conditioned to feel unsafe unless you're perfect, admired, desirable, in control. Let's go deeper. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, said, "Man is condemned to be free." He meant that with consciousness comes the burden of choice, of responsibility, of identity. But instead of embracing freedom, many people trade it for security. Obey the script, get the job, suppress the voice, numb the pain. Why? Because choosing authenticity over approval requires courage. Because asking, "Who am I?" might destroy the comfortable illusion. But the price of that safety? Anxiety. The soul can't breathe in a life that isn't real. Here's the radical shift. What if anxiety isn't the problem, but the pointer? It points to a life lived out of alignment, a role played too long, a truth swallowed too deep, a boundary never enforced, a voice silenced repeatedly. Anxiety is your psyche saying, "This is not the life you were meant for." Now let's speak of trauma, not just the big, catastrophic events, but the chronic, subtle ones. The love you had to earn, the affection that came with conditions, the emotions you had to hide to be accepted. Psychologist Gabor Mate describes trauma as not what happens to you, but what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And what happens inside? You disconnect from yourself. You become hypervigilant. You fear stillness. You distrust joy. You monitor everyone's emotions but ignore your own. That's anxiety. A body on alert. A mind scanning for threats. A soul still waiting to be seen. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer believed that suffering is embedded in the structure of desire. The more you want control, certainty, status, the more anxiety you breed. You live in a culture of endless desire. You must be more, do more, prove more. You're told to chase happiness, but that chase is endless. And so your baseline becomes restless unease. Because the moment you arrive at what you thought you needed, the bar moves again. Let's piece it together. You're caught between the authentic self that wants truth, depth, rest, presence, and the conditioned self that wants control, approval, and perfection. The self that wants to be, and the self that must always perform. And the battleground where these two selves meet? Anxiety. But what if you didn't fight it this time? What if you listened? What if the question isn't, "How do I get rid of this anxiety?" but rather, "What is this anxiety trying to protect me from? And what truth is it trying to deliver?" Because beneath every anxious thought is a suppressed truth, a disowned part of you waiting to return, a buried need asking to be felt. We are almost there. But before we talk about freedom, we must examine the invisible cost of not listening to this signal. Because anxiety, unaddressed, misunderstood, doesn't fade. It evolves. It seeps into how you love, speak, sleep, trust, and dream. And that's where we go next. You might think you've learned to live with it. The shallow breaths, the racing heart, the tight chest, the endless inner monologue that plays like background static in your life. You've named it anxiety, labeled it, even tried to manage it. You've built your life around it, carefully avoiding triggers, shrinking your world to stay safe, saying yes when you want to scream no, laughing when your chest is actually caving in. But here's what no one told you. When you ignore anxiety, you don't just carry a feeling, you become its shape. To avoid what you feel, you slowly start re-architecting your existence. You say, "I'm just tired," instead of, "I'm scared." You cancel plans because your nervous system is screaming, but you call it self-care. You stay in jobs, relationships, habits that no longer fit, just to avoid rocking the boat. Little by little, your world gets smaller. Not physically, but psychologically. You stop reaching. You stop trusting. You stop being. And in this shrinking, the most tragic thing happens. You begin to forget who you were before fear became your compass. Here's a subtle but devastating truth. When you suppress anxiety, you don't just suppress anxiety, you suppress joy. You suppress connection. You suppress creativity, curiosity, love, because you can't selectively numb emotions. In trying to escape pain, you mute your entire emotional range. And what's left is numbness, a mechanical life with smiles worn like masks. This is the cost of pretending you're fine. This is the tax anxiety collects when ignored. Anxiety doesn't just haunt your body, it rewires your brain. You start scanning every room for danger. You read faces for signs of judgment. You assume silence means rejection. You hear, "Are you okay?" as, "You're weak." You interpret uncertainty as doom. It's not logic that runs your mind anymore. It's hypervigilance. You think you're just cautious, but really, your inner world has become a battlefield. And what's worse, your brain begins to reward this behavior. Avoidance feels safe. Control feels necessary. Overthinking feels productive. But all it's really doing is tightening the leash around your freedom. Unchecked anxiety often has roots in unprocessed trauma, tiny or tectonic. But trauma is tricky. It doesn't announce itself with clarity. It shows up as fear of intimacy, fear of stillness, the constant need to prove yourself, a sense that something bad is always about to happen. You might say, "But nothing traumatic happened to me." That doesn't mean you weren't shaped by trauma. You can be traumatized by consistent emotional neglect, being shamed for your feelings, living in a home where you had to perform to be loved. And when that trauma isn't faced, anxiety becomes the loop you can't escape. You fear the same things. You react the same way. You self-sabotage again and again, because part of you still believes pain is safer than vulnerability. Nowhere does anxiety leave a deeper mark than in your relationships. You begin to love cautiously. You withhold the truth out of fear they'll leave. You become hyper-aware of every pause, every tone, every silence. You anticipate abandonment before connection can even begin. Or you swing to the opposite pole, cling, overgive, lose yourself trying to make them stay. Why? Because your nervous system doesn't see love as nourishment, it sees it as risk, as something to brace against. And so you either run, or you bend until you disappear. Anxiety becomes the wall between you and intimacy. Not because you don't want connection, but because part of you believes you don't deserve peace. Anxiety robs you of more than calm, it steals your aliveness. How many ideas have you silenced because they weren't good enough? How many dreams have you postponed because, what if I fail? How many times have you felt inspiration rise, only to kill it with overthinking? Anxiety disguises itself as caution, but its true weapon is paralysis. It convinces you not to begin, and so you never get to see what you're capable of, because you're too busy managing the fear of judgment. Your gift stays locked inside, and the world never sees what could have been. But it doesn't end with you. When we don't address our anxiety, when we normalize emotional avoidance, we silently pass it on. To our children, to our partners, to our communities. We raise people who are afraid to feel, who confuse anxiety for identity, who think perfection is the price of love. This is how generational cycles are born, not through intention, but through avoidance. And it's here we face the deepest consequence of all, the death of the authentic self. Because the more we listen to anxiety without ever decoding it, the more we build lives, careers, families, and futures from fear, not freedom. And that, right there, is the cost. But here's the thing. Even now, under all the layers of defense, control, numbing, and silence, there is still something in you that knows. Something that hasn't forgotten who you are beneath the anxiety. Something that remembers the rhythm of your real self. Something that aches for a life not ruled by fear, but led by truth. And now, we must meet that part. Not with logic, not with resistance, but with radical curiosity. Because the only way out of the trap is not to kill the anxiety, but to understand what it's protecting. And that's where rebellion begins. What if you stopped fighting anxiety? What if the way out was not through more control, but through surrender? Not to the fear, but to the truth behind it. Because here's the paradox. The more you try to eliminate anxiety, the more power you give it. The more you listen to it, not as an enemy, but as a messenger, the less you have to fear it. This is not about coping. It's about rebellion. A conscious, radical rebellion against the false self you were forced to become. Your anxiety didn't come from nowhere. It was built upon invisible lies, Whispers that sounded like truth because you heard them so early, so often. Lies like, you must be perfect to be loved. Feeling deeply makes you weak. Your worth depends on what you achieve. Safety means never taking risks. Speaking your truth is dangerous. These lies form the foundation of your anxiety. So the first step isn't to calm down, it's to call it out. Ask yourself, whose story am I living? Whose voice is still echoing inside me? Whose fear did I inherit and mistake for my own? When you name the lie, you reclaim your power to rewrite the script. Anxiety lives in your thoughts, yes, but it originates in the body. The racing heart, the clenched jaw, the tight chest, the shallow breath. These are not just symptoms, they are signals, and most of us spend our lives trying to escape them rather than feel them. But rebellion requires embodiment. You cannot think your way out of a feeling. You have to feel your way through it. That means practicing stillness, even when it feels unsafe, breathing deeply into tension instead of fighting it, letting the tears come without needing a reason, moving the body to process what words cannot express. Gabor Mate writes, "The body says what the mind cannot." If you want freedom, you must learn to listen with the body, not just the brain. Anxiety thrives in disconnection. Disconnection from your needs, from your voice, from your values, from your present moment. Most of us were never taught how to be authentic. We were taught how to be acceptable. But authenticity is not a luxury. It is your birthright. And it's your path back to peace. Ask yourself, what am I pretending not to feel? What parts of me have I silenced to survive? What would I do differently if I stopped performing? Start small. Say no when you mean no. Speak the thing you usually bury. Let people see the real you, even when it's messy. Rebellion starts not with grand gestures, but with honest moments. Here's something radical. Anxiety is not fear of the unknown. It's fear of being unprepared. You've learned to believe that if you control enough variables, you can avoid discomfort. But life doesn't work that way. What if you stopped needing certainty to feel safe? What if, instead of asking, "What if it goes wrong?" you asked, "What if I can handle it, even if it does?" Fear is not a stop sign. It's an invitation to expand, to stretch, to discover. When you reframe anxiety as a call to courage, not a command to freeze, you change everything. Anxiety is the future hijacking the present. It's your mind writing horror stories about things that haven't happened, while your body suffers as if they already have. The rebellion is in return. Return to now. Return to breath. Return to sensation. Presence is not passive. It's powerful. Because when you are fully here, in this moment, you rob anxiety of its greatest weapon, projection. Practice it. Notice 5 things you can see. Feel your feet touching the ground. Say what's true right now, not what you're afraid might happen. This moment is where healing begins. Always. Anxiety thrives in isolation. It grows in silence. It feeds on the belief that no one would understand. But healing is a relational act. You weren't wounded alone. You won't heal alone. Find safe people. Speak the thing you've never said. Ask for help not as weakness, but as wisdom. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is let someone see your fear, and stay. You've spent years managing anxiety. What if you spent the next chapter becoming the person who no longer needs it? That means building an identity rooted not in fear, but in truth. Not, "I'm anxious, so I avoid people," but, "I feel anxious, and I choose to connect anyway." Not, "I'm broken, but I am learning how to be whole." The more you show up as your real self, the less anxiety has to protect. Freedom is not becoming someone new, it's becoming someone real. And now, you stand at the threshold. You've understood the cause, you've named the cost, you've glimpsed the rebellion. But one final piece remains, the deepest layer. Because even now, after all the insight, all the self-work, all the effort, there is one truth that can shatter the foundation of your anxiety entirely. And that's where we go next. So here you are. You've peeled back the layers. You've named the lie, felt the fear, challenged the narrative. You've begun the rebellion. But beneath all of it, beneath the emotional tension, the racing thoughts, the habits of control, there is still something deeper. A final, haunting truth that anxiety has been trying to keep you from seeing. Not because it wants to harm you, but because it wants to protect you. And that truth is this: you are not who you think you are. You think you're the overthinker, the overachiever, the one who has to manage everything, please everyone, stay composed. You think you're the anxious person, the broken one, the misfit, the fragile one who can't handle life like others do. But that is not you. That is the identity your anxiety built to keep you safe. From the moment you first felt pain, emotional abandonment, humiliation, rejection, your mind made a decision. I'll never let this happen again. And so you built defenses. You became hyperaware. You anticipated needs. You silenced your own. You tried to be perfect, useful, agreeable, invisible, whatever would guarantee you wouldn't feel that same pain again. You started calling these strategies me, but they were never you. They were just armor. Beautiful, clever, exhausting armor. Your anxiety didn't arise because you are weak. It arose because you are intelligent, sensitive, and deeply attuned to threat. It was your protection system. But now that protection is suffocating you. Because the threats it was built to avoid, they're no longer real. But the armor remains. Beneath that identity lives someone else. Someone who was never broken, just buried. Someone who was never too much, just told to shrink. Someone who didn't need fixing, just witnessing. That real you is not defined by how well they avoid pain, but how deeply they feel. Not by how little they ask for, but how courageously they speak truth. The real you is not anxious. The real you is alive. And the anxiety? It's the alarm system that started screaming when you abandoned that self. The moment you began living someone else's story, someone else's version of success, someone else's definition of safety. The moment you stopped asking, "What do I want?" and started asking, "What will keep me accepted?" Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, said, "When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. But in your case, it's not always pleasure, it's control. You distract yourself with managing, fixing, anticipating. You think if you can just make life predictable, you'll feel peace. But life isn't predictable. And peace doesn't come from control. It comes from meaning. Anxiety begins to dissolve the moment you stop chasing perfection and start pursuing what matters. Not what impresses. Not what protects. But what awakens you. Here is the deepest revelation. Anxiety is not asking you to be less afraid. It's asking you to be more whole. It's not trying to destroy you. It's trying to integrate you. To reconnect the parts you exiled. To reawaken the truths you silenced. To remind you that wholeness is not found in being calm, but in being real. You don't heal anxiety by becoming someone different. You heal it by remembering who you were before the fear took over. By returning to the moment you first believed you weren't enough. And telling that younger version of you, you were never the problem. Imagine now walking through the ruins of your former self. The place where you used to armor up. Where you used to say, "I'm fine," with a smile that didn't reach your eyes. Where you used to panic at silence, dread being alone, recoil at vulnerability. Now you walk slowly, with presence, with breath, with awareness. You see the masks on the floor, the armor rusting, the mirror reflecting not the anxious self, but the real one. No longer hidden, no longer afraid to be seen. Because you are not your coping mechanisms, you are not your past pain, you are not your fear. You are what remains when the fear is witnessed, felt, held, and then let go. So now you face a choice. Not to eliminate anxiety, but to listen to it. To ask, what have I been running from? What part of me is aching to return? What would life look like if I stopped managing and started living? Anxiety doesn't need you to fix it. It needs you to stop pretending. Because once you are fully honest, anxiety has no more secrets to protect. And maybe, just maybe, the moment you allow yourself to feel it all, without shame, without control, without apology, that's when peace finds you. Not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped hiding from yourself.